Everything is permanently impermanent and impermanently permanent. Existence is non-existent, and non-existence exists. The Buddha called his teaching the middle way, and it is full of this kind of yes, no, and both and. I'm Kevin Caldwell. Welcome to Sacred Wisdom, Sacred Texts, an exploration of some of humanity's most influential sacred writings. They've become my soul friends, daily companions, spiritual guides, and springs of wisdom. The journey of the Buddha was inspired by 4 sights: old age, sickness, death, and a contented monk. The starting point for him was a realization that hit him with deep emotional force, that aging was his future, that he too might very likely experience a long and debilitating illness, and that he would most certainly become a corpse, a body slowly rotting into the soil. He saw in himself, we're told, in other Buddhist texts, the inner revulsions he felt towards old people and sick people and rotting corpses. But then he imagined himself in each of those conditions and knew that his revulsion was something he needed to face and release. That 4th sight, the contented monk, offered the Buddha the hope that perhaps suffering was not inevitable after all. Perhaps he too could find that contentment. The beginning point of his journey, then, was the meeting point where his internal self-awareness and his mindfulness towards things he observed externally converged. That dynamic is one of the gifts the Buddha offers to the sacred heritages of humanity. In my own experience, it's one of the gifts he's given me. Not only does he tell me to be self-aware and mindful, he teaches a path to cultivate these things in myself. And of course, the reason he can teach it is because he experienced it. The path he teaches is grounded in the way he himself cultivated self-awareness and mindfulness and insight, what he called direct knowledge of things as they are. And that led to his awakening, and then to the delivery of his first sutta, this discourse, which we began opening up in episodes 11 and 12. In those prior episodes, we've been introduced to the middle way, which actually is the Eightfold Path, the first portion of which is the 4 Noble Truths. The 4th of those is the Eightfold Path. These form the integrated, interlocking essence of everything the Buddha would teach in much more expansive ways in other discourses. In episode 12, we dug into the first 2 of the 4 Noble Truths, the Buddha's diagnosis and treatment plan for what's wrong. That all begins with looking at symptoms. There is suffering. That's Noble Truth 1. There's then a diagnosis. Craving is the cause of suffering. That's Noble Truth 2. And now we come to the question a patient might ask their doctor on receiving the news that their symptoms have led to a very serious diagnosis. Something like, okay, well, can this be cured? And the Buddha's answer is yes, there is a cure, which brings us to Noble Truth 3, the cessation of suffering. And here's how he said it. Now, this, bhikkhus, his followers, is the noble truth of the cessation of suffering. It is the remainderless fading away and cessation of that same craving, the giving up and relinquishing of it, freedom from it, non-reliance on it. So suffering can cease if the cause of suffering ceases. If craving ceases, then so does suffering. The cessation of the craving that fuels suffering has several modifiers describing it in what Buddha has just said. It's remainderless, a way of describing the totality of the cessation here. It's 110% complete. And that speaks of the result or the outcome of ceasing. Giving up and relinquishing. This describes the internal process that's required, a process of letting go of craving. Freedom from it is another modifier, and this captures the reality that craving leaves us stuck, or as the Buddha would often say, fettered, chained. This describes how we experience cessation, not merely as a concept, but a reality of freedom. Non-reliance. This describes a different mode of existing. As we will see soon, that word existing is tricky when we're trying to understand the Buddha, but I'm using it here to describe the dynamic that one aspect of the endless loop of suffering and craving is that we rely upon certain ways of living and thinking. We rely on our sensory and cognitive experiences and on the illusions that these are objectively real and on the illusion that there's an unchanging me that has those experiences, all of which should sound familiar to those who might have come across episode 12. Non-reliance then implies that one has ceased relying on all of that illusion. And when one relies, what one relies on instead is going to be outlined in the fourth truth when we get to it. In Truths 1 and 2, the Buddha explained that craving causes suffering in various ways. For one, there is a psychological element to suffering, our experience of wanting, getting, not having, then wanting again, an endless cycle aimed at a constantly changing set of objects or experiences or states of being that we want. But for the Buddha, there's more to this than just our psychological internal experience of craving, which results in attaching us to what we want. Attachment, actually, is at the very core of the way things are. In episode 12, we looked at the 5 aggregates, as they're called: physical form, feeling, perceptions, mental concepts or formations, and consciousness or awareness. These are all bundles, and we are all bundles, made up of those bundles, in a constantly changing recombination, each of which depends on the prior bundle and upon new sensory and cognitive stimuli. In other words, everything we've just described is a bundle of various experiences that are dependent on other experiences and stimuli. Everything is a bundle. What we perceive is a bundle or an aggregate of all of that. It's the Buddha's way of describing the fact that nothing exists independently of other things or other experiences, other stimuli, other concepts and ideas. Everything is a bundle of interdependent things, quote unquote. Every person, you and I, we're all bundles of passing experiences and thoughts and events. This is central to the Buddha's whole Dhamma, his teaching. So it's worth restating this. We're all bundles made up of a constantly changing recombination of experiences that arise as a result of and because of physical forms we encounter, feelings we have, perceptions we make, mental concepts and formations, ideas, theories, etc., and consciousness, awareness. Each recombination depends on the prior bundle and upon new sensory and cognitive stimuli. Consciousness, note, is also dependent on this constantly recombining bundle of these aggregates. There's no consciousness apart from that chain, according to the Buddha. What causes us to experience this constantly changing torrent as suffering is craving. Some of those experiences are pleasant and positive, and we want to either get them or repeat them or keep them. That's craving, and it leads to suffering because nothing is permanent. So the cessation of craving leads to a detachment from that chain, and that detachment from the chain then leads to the cessation of suffering. All of which leads ultimately to the utter peace and stillness of nibbana or nirvana, the end of the endless cycle of existence, and this is important, as we know it. and thus can be called non-existence. Now, does this mean that nibbana or nirvana, one is the Pali word and one is the Sanskrit word, as non-existence is the total cessation of, for example, a person? The Buddha's view of this is nuanced. It's an example of his middle way. If we could ask him about this, I imagine the conversation might go something like this. Buddha, does cessation and nibbana or nirvana mean the cessation of the self, I ask. He says, yes. I press the question again because I'm concerned. Does that mean that I just cease to exist as a person? No, he replies. The Buddha is addressing things from within the context of ideas and theories of his time. In particular, the question of whether there is an Atman, namely a never-changing, permanent self that is other than this world of experiences and sights and sounds and mental formulations that we've just been discussing and which typically we assume is real. That conversation's at the very heart of the Bhagavad Gita, for example, which was coming into written form at roughly the same time as when the Buddha lived and thought and taught. The Buddha says no to the idea of a permanent, non-dependent self. Selves are bundles of experiences that each arise from each other and from other stimuli. Kevin, quote unquote, is the name, Buddha would say, given to one of those constantly changing bundles. That's what I am, and that's what you would know. And here is the middle way in two applications. Let me try to explain. This Kevin, in this moment, is neither the same nor different from the Kevin of a moment ago. He's not the same because the bundle is constantly changing. But he's also not different because it is this bundle, Kevin, that has changed in dependence on the prior bundle, Kevin. The bundles are connected. The bundle we call Kevin, the bundles we call Kevin, the sequence of bundles we call Kevin are connected not by a self that is somehow aloof from and detached from those changes, but by the dependence of this bundle on the prior one and the prior one and the prior one and the prior one, which in turn, of course, is dependent on all sorts of other stimuli and interactions with other bundles. So, Kevin is not eternal, pre-existing, and existing apart from this interdependent chain, but at the same time, cessation of attachment to the chain through that occurs by giving up craving doesn't mean that Kevin is annihilated, turned into nothingness. Though the Buddha says there is no permanent self, his concept of cessation doesn't mean non-existence as we might assume. It might be better to say instead it's a different sort of existence, that non-existence exists. Nirvana is cessation, yes, but it's the ceasing of conditioned experience, this chain of bundles. It's the ceasing of that conditioned existence and conditioned consciousness, and thus of the conditioned self. As such, it's described as peace, stillness, the absence of air of craving and attachment. But that doesn't mean that there's no other way of existing. Now, I just used the word exist again, and I think the Buddha would say that speaking of existence is automatically bringing in the descriptions and imaginations and explanations and vocabulary that are grounded in our mental formulations about the idea of existence as some sort of permanent, unchanging reality. It's using the word existence is tying me back into all the bundles and the aggregates and the dependent ideas, the ideas that arise in dependence on other things. And I agree with him, but I don't know of another word to use than existence. Well, that's actually not exactly true. I know the word the Buddha had for it, nibbana or nirvana, the end to conditioned existence. And that's why the Buddha speaks of non-existence as a positive thing, as something to seek as a result of the Eightfold Path. I'll put it in my own words again, knowing that it's not how he would say it. Non-existence exists. Well, then what's it like? This is something that we're going to be coming back to as we proceed down the Eightfold Path, but let me give it a bit of a preview here. In some expressions of Buddhist teaching, there is something universal about compassion. It can be experienced, it can be extended, it can be described as filling everything or encompassing everything. It seems to me that the closest thing to a Buddhist idea of what Western philosophy might call ultimate reality is this compassion. But we'll have to say a lot more about that in the future. And in fact, at some point, I'm going to bring the Buddha and the Bhagavad Gita and the Gospel of John back into the same room to talk about all this self and reality stuff. But here I need to go back to the exploration of the Buddha's teaching and therefore move on to the fourth of the Noble Truths, which is the treatment plan. We've seen the symptoms, we've had the diagnosis, we know that it is curable, so what's the treatment? And that brings us to Truth 4, there is a way. And here's the Buddha's words again. Now this, my followers, bhikkhus, is the noble truth of the way leading to the cessation of suffering. It is this Noble Eightfold Path, namely, right view, right resolve, right speech, right action, right livelihood, right effort, right mindfulness, right concentration. So the way out, the cure of this disease of suffering, is the Eightfold Path, which begins with coming to a right view of our situation, the situation of everything, of all beings. And the right view is that there is suffering, that there's a cause to it, that it can cease, and that there's a way for it to cease. In other words, the Four Noble Truths are the very first element. They define what it means to have right view. And in one sense, that's all easy enough to grasp. It'd be easy to think to myself, okay, got it, great, what's next? And move on to the next element in the Eightfold Path. But the Buddha won't allow that. The next section of this discourse makes it clear that he wants us to do a lot more than just understand that there are four truths and what they mean. He wants us to experience them, to have direct knowledge of them, and to really see everything in light of them. Seeing everything in light of them, that is what having right view means. Now, if we've never flown internationally, and we get told that flying from Los Angeles to Tokyo is a long flight, in one sense we would understand, right? We know what the words mean, and maybe we've even flown domestically in the United States, where I'm from, coast to coast, an experience of 5 or 6 hours on a plane. And so we can imagine a much longer flight. But until we actually sit in the plane for 12 to 14 hours, we don't really know. Likewise, until we board the plane for the journey that the Buddha is inviting us to undertake, until we sit in the four truths, as it were, and make the journey, we will not even have begun to enter the Eightfold Path. We will not have what he calls right view. The Buddha says that there are 3 stages of coming to have a right view about each of the 4 Noble Truths. And he now repeats each of the 4 truths and explains the 3 stages of having a right view of them. I'm going to take the time to read that whole section all at once, in which he describes the 3 stages in connection with each of the 4 truths. It'll give us a bit of a taste not only of what the Buddha is saying here, but of his teaching style. He was an oral teacher, and he makes use of repetition, as you've probably already picked up, but you're going to see very clearly here. It's a way to enable his words to imprint themselves in the minds and hearts of his followers. So just listen in each case for the three stages. And those three stages, just so you can listen to them or for them, are first, just the raw being aware of the existence of the truth in question. So, for example, there is suffering. Great. That's stage one. Second, realizing that I'm going to have to fully understand this. That's the second stage, actually realizing, okay, I don't really know everything. I'm going to have to come to a deeper awareness and experience of this. And then the third stage is actually getting to the stage where you can look back and say, you know what? I have fully understood that one. All right, here's how he put it in his own words. This is the noble truth of suffering, quote unquote. So, bhikkhus, in regard to things unheard before, there arose in me vision, knowledge, wisdom, true knowledge, and light. Next, this noble truth of suffering is to be fully understood. So, bhikkhus, in regard to things unheard before, there arose in me vision, knowledge, wisdom, true knowledge, and light. This noble truth of suffering has been fully understood. So, bhikkhus, in regard to things unheard before, there arose in me vision, knowledge, wisdom, true knowledge, and light. Notice how in each of the stages there is vision, knowledge, wisdom, true knowledge, and light. So much more than just raw knowing, even of the fact that, oh, there is suffering. So each of these three stages is very kind of complex and nuanced, and I would even say mysterious. So those are the three stages applied to that first truth, and then he goes on. The noble truth of the origin of suffering. So, bhikkhus, in regard to things unheard before, there arose in me vision, knowledge, wisdom, true knowledge, and light. This noble truth of the origin of suffering is to be abandoned, let go of. Thus, bhikkhus, in regard to things unheard before, there arose in me vision, knowledge, wisdom, true knowledge, and light. This noble truth of the origin of suffering has been abandoned. Thus, bhikkhus, in regard to things unheard before, there arose in me vision, knowledge, wisdom, true knowledge, and light. Notice here, in addition to just knowing about what it means to cease craving and to let go, he's talking about the experience of abandoning it. All right. Then he gets to the third noble truth, cessation of suffering. This is the noble truth of the cessation of suffering. Thus, bhikkhus, in regard to things unheard before, there arose in me vision, knowledge, wisdom, true knowledge, and light. This noble truth of the cessation of suffering is to be realized, fully embraced and known. In regards to things unheard before, there arose in me vision, knowledge, wisdom, true knowledge, and light. This noble truth of the cessation of suffering has been realized. Thus, bhikkhus, in regard to things unheard before, there arose in me vision, knowledge, wisdom, true knowledge, and light. And now we come to the fourth of the noble truths. This is the noble truth of the way leading to the cessation of suffering. Thus, bhikkhus, in regard to things unheard before, there arose in me vision, knowledge, wisdom, true knowledge, and light. This noble truth of the way leading to the cessation of suffering is to be developed, cultivated, grown, pressed into. Thus, bhikkhus, in regard to things unheard before, there arose in me vision, knowledge, wisdom, true knowledge, and light. This noble truth of the way leading to the cessation of suffering has been developed. I've done it, so to speak. So, bhikkhus, in regard to things unheard before, there arose in me vision, knowledge, wisdom, true knowledge, and light. You see how the three stages and the Four Noble Truths are a process of not just knowing, but actually applying, living in, putting into practice, putting into reality what the Buddha is teaching. And then he goes on to say, so long, bhikkhus, as my knowledge and vision of these Four Noble Truths, as they really are in their 3 phases and 12 aspects, was not thoroughly purified in this way, I did not claim to have awakened to the unsurpassed perfect enlightenment in this world. The knowledge and vision arose in me. Unshakable is the liberation of my mind. This is my last birth. Now there is no more renewed existence. Now, from all of that, I want to focus on several things. I want to talk a little bit more about this phrase he repeats, things never heard before. I want to just briefly touch on what this whole mention of 3 stages and 12 aspects refers to, in case that was confusing. And then I want to bring us to a close by talking a bit about Buddha's awakening or enlightenment. First, the mention of things never heard before. This is a way speaking of the Buddha's path of enlightenment through direct observation, direct knowing, personal experience and awareness, self-awareness, all of it. We know from his own words that he consulted many different teachers in his search for guidance. He, of course, employed vocabulary and concepts common to others of his day, as would be necessary for anyone in order to communicate. But his Dhamma, his teaching, was not something he learned from those teachers or schools of philosophy and spirituality. In fact, what he learned was that they were not able to show him the way. Nor is the Buddha claiming to have received revelation. There's nothing like, for example, the Hebrew prophetic tradition in his teaching, or the idea of the Quran being sent down from God and then recited by Muhammad. The Buddha says he came to know these things directly. But this doesn't mean that he made it up. He came to the truths of his Dhamma, his teaching, through his own meditation and reflection, but the Dhamma existed. He didn't make it, he found it. And anyone can, we're told. His teaching, though, is intended to help us find it. But in theory, anyone could do so, even without that help. So that's a bit about the never heard before stuff. Next, the 3 stages and the 12 aspects. There are 3 stages, as we mentioned, in the process of fully gaining a right view, and these 3 stages are to be applied to each of the 4 noble truths. The reference to the 12 aspects then points to the simple math that there's 4 truths, and each truth is to be embraced in a 3-stage process. So 3 times 4, 12. The 3 stages move through increasing depths of realization and knowledge and in action, putting in action. Not inaction like laziness and not acting, but putting into reality. There's first, of course, the recognition, the mental assent that this is true. There is the truth of suffering or the cause of suffering, cessation of suffering, the way to do it, all of that. So just knowing what these things mean and agreeing they are true is just that first step. The second stage is grasping that there are implications of my agreement that these are true. If I say that thing is true, then more is required of me than mere assent, at least if I actually want for suffering to cease. As the Buddha says, the noble truth of suffering is to be fully understood, and as he goes on to say, fully realized, fully enacted, and so on. And then finally, there's the stage of actually coming to the right view, which the Buddha describes as this noble truth of suffering, the cause, the cessation, and the path, and that has been not only fully understood, but fully activated, fully followed, fully put into practice. To experience the 4 truths fully through each of these 3 stages is typically a long process. Many Buddhist meditation practices are aimed at assisting us on the journey with various aspects of this, and the Eightfold Path in particular provides a lot more insight into all of it. Indeed, since the 8 elements are the path to the 4th truth, so to speak, then they're the path that is mentioned in the 4th of the Noble Truths. Then one can't proceed fully without getting to the 3rd stage with it. In other words, by the time we get to Noble Truth 4, that there is a path, we can't complete that one until we've gone through all stages of that 4th truth, which is the Eightfold Path in all its fullness. All 8 elements have been fully realized, put into practice, fully understood, and fully embraced or embodied, so to speak, in my life. Not the words Buddha would use, but I think it helps make the point. And that brings me to the other thing that I wanted to touch on here from the long portion that I read from the Buddha, and that's the reference to Buddha's awakening and enlightenment. The Buddha said that until he had come to fully understand the Four Truths, he didn't claim to have awakened. Since the fourth truth contains the Eightfold Path, it means that until he had fully understood all elements of the path and put them into his own life and practice, he didn't claim to have achieved enlightenment. Awakening and enlightenment are used interchangeably here. What he means by them, these two words, is contained in the closing words of the section I quoted. Unshakable is the liberation of my mind. This is the last birth. There is now no more renewed existence. In other words, he's saying that he experienced this. His mind is now unfettered from the aggregates and the bundles of conditioned existence. He's free from attachment to all of that. He's cut the cord of craving, free from it, free from the anger and the delusion that are often associated with craving in the Buddha's teaching. His teaching is not a theory, in other words. It's not a philosophy, even though there are profound philosophical elements and implications of it. He knows nibbana, nirvana, directly by experience. Notice, though, because he's standing there talking to his disciples, that this means that nibbana, nirvana can be experienced in this life prior to physical death. The Buddha was present as a human being when he gave this sutta. Enlightenment and awakening and the cessation of all the chain can happen as he was in this life. Nibbana, nirvana is not akin to the Christian or Islamic idea of heaven. It is described as a state or even a domain, and that's a complicated idea, but we'll have to come back to that another time. In the Buddha's case, as he stands or sits with his 5 friends and shares this sutta, as he's present as the person we know of as the Buddha, he can say that he knows that this is his last birth and that there will be no more renewed existence. He's outside the loop of beginning and ending, both in the form of birth and rebirth, in kind of the big sense, and in the micro expression of that loop in the form of the daily experience of beginnings and endings, and then new beginnings and more endings of events and moments and thoughts and feelings, etc. All of that, he says, has ceased here and now, even as he continues to breathe and walk and eat and sleep and teach. The loop of conditioned existence has ceased in its totality, he says. Now, on hearing this, we're told that one of his 5 followers became the first to understand these teachings fully, and as a result, attained what is called stream entry, the first stage of enlightenment. This stands, I think, as a way of representing the fact that this sutta is not just a discourse for the 5 bhikkhus present on that occasion. It's an invitation to everyone who encounters the Dhamma of the Buddha, which now includes you and I. The experience of that one follower signals the conclusion of the sutta as well. The combination of the Buddha's teaching and the response of the disciple leads to the statement that the wheel of Dhamma is set in motion, hence the title of this sutta, the setting in motion of the wheel of Dhamma. And though there are just 5 people present with the Buddha at the time, and only one is said to have got it initially, although the others do soon after, the wheel of the teaching is now set in motion by this. And history tells us that it kept rolling. For here we are, about 2,500 years later, seeking to understand it. It's rolled all the way to our doorstep. Now, before I conclude, I've got a confession to make. I left something out. And if you've read the sutta for yourself, you may already be aware of that and wondering what I was going to do. Because I have skipped over a whole section in the discourse. After the Buddha had described the 3 stages of knowing for each of the 4 Noble Truths, and before he described his enlightenment and liberation, there was a cosmic response to all of this, according to the author of the sutta, who says that the 10,000-fold cosmos shivered and quivered and quaked while a great measureless radiance appeared in the cosmos, surpassing the effulgence of all the deities. There's a whole panoply of different types of beings and entities which inhabit the cosmos in that statement. The Buddha goes on in the sutta that we're consulting here to mention Maras and Brahmas, contemplatives, Brahmins, royalty, and common folk. He also describes different kinds of what are called devas, shining ones. He says there's earth devas, devas of the 4 great kings, devas of the 33, devas of the hours, contented devas, devas delighting in creation, devas wielding power over the creation of others, devas of Brahma's retinue. Now, what is all that about? I'm going to have to return to that mysterious world in the next episode. And then once we've looked at that, there are still the other 7 elements of the Eightfold Path to look at as well. But by now you can hear the music in the background, and you know what that means. We will come back to all of this next time.